Thank you, everybody, for joining us. My name is Mark Leprado with Epoch Xperience. I am here with Meghan Sullivan, the podcast host of History and Games podcast. Meghan, I want to extend my appreciation that you joined us today. Your podcast is perfect for what we do here at Epoch Xperience. We're going to get into the podcast a little later, but I do want to kind of start with your earlier years, because it's always interesting to see how everybody starts getting into history and how it really builds into this video game side. So thank you again for being here.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. I'm really excited that you asked me to join you.
Of course, of course. So I wanted to start, you graduated from the University of San Francisco, and it was a Master's of Asian Studies and Civilization, is that correct?
That's correct.
So what was, I mean, that's a very, very specific and very focused master's. What was kind of the launching point for something like that?
You want the impressive answer or the honest answer?
I kind of like the impressive one.
Well, I'll give your audience the honest answer because I think they'll appreciate it. But 2 words for you: Sailor Moon.
Okay.
Which
Okay.
I got into Japanese culture like a lot of people. Anime was my gateway into Japanese culture, and then it matured from anime and video games into actual history and culture and politics and whatnot. And so I'm just as enthused about watching a Japanese cooking show as I am anime now. But when anyone asks me, like, how did you get into, like, why did you decide to do a master's in Asian study? And I'm like, well, because I actually really I've always loved different Asian cultures and history. But if you want to ask me, like, literally how I stumbled upon it, I always kind of cringe and I'm like, Sailor Moon, because it's true. So shout out to anime, however you can get into new languages and cultures and history. I mean, sometimes pop culture is your guide.
I think that is kind of a really important point. So I'm kind of glad you went with the honest answer. You don't know what's going to suck into something, and it doesn't matter really what it is. Sailor Moon, video games, a movie of any sort. So I think that's actually kind of awesome. And look at where it really has brought you. Would you think without Sailor Moon that you would be doing the podcast or even be kind of as ingrained in gaming as you are now?
I do think the answer is yes. I think it would have been a different path, but the destination would have been the same. I grew up in a family that loves history. I mean, my family's home is full of history books. We've always loved history. I was into Greek history and mythology and Egyptian history and mythology since I was a little girl. And I've always loved video games. I mean, like, I can't really remember my life without video games. In fact, I'm part of the Oregon Trail generation, which, for those who don't know, it's the generation that grew up playing Oregon Trail in computer class back in the day.
Yep.
Which was where I realized that, like, education and video games, edutainment, if you will, is a real thing, and it's a real way to teach people things. So I do think I might have ended up where I am, but I think that loving something like Japanese pop culture really just, slammed down the accelerator and got me there even faster. But, I think for people who love history, they've always kind of loved history. And if you've loved video games, you always kind of love video games. And so this is just like the Reese's peanut butter cups of both worlds, the delicious chocolate and peanut butter combined together.
That is very true. And now I'm very hungry. So it's funny that you mentioned Oregon Trail. That is probably like the quintessential first historical video game that's out there. But I think it gets forgotten because it's so old, and they don't. I mean, I kind of grew up in the same generation where you did keyboard in class for 10 minutes and then you played Oregon Trail for the rest of the class. But that is, when you look at it now, it doesn't seem immersive, but it really is. You get kind of sucked into that whole experience of traveling from traveling to towards the Oregon Trail goes to California, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's funny that is kind of how that starts. And I would like to say most people, I'd say we're probably about the same age. Most people about our age have the same launching point for history, because Oregon Trail was kind of part of our upbringing in school. So we went from Oregon Trail to Sailor Moon. You have your Master's in Asian Studies and Civilization. And then we kind of fast forward a little bit to IGN, where you work as a content creator, and you seem to maybe, I'm going to say, put the halt on your historical fascination, but it seems that your content was more guided by role-playing games.
Yes, so I was kind of the queen of JRPGs for a while. Although actually, I was never actually on the editorial team. I was on the database team. So we actually did a lot of content management.
Okay.
And then throughout the years, people are like, "Oh, Megan knows JRPGs. Hey, do you want to review this game? Sure. Oh, hey, do you want to interview this person? Sure." So I actually was really lucky. I had sort of one foot in two worlds because even though I wasn't technically on the editorial side, the people at IGN were nice enough to be like, "We know you love JRPGs. We know you love God of War. We know you love Borderlands. We need someone to review this game." So I got a lot of experience that way. And it was a lot of fun, but you're right. And if you think about it, Oregon Trail was one of the original RPGs because you had to make decisions and, it was, I don't know how stat based it was, but like whether you cross that river and survived, there were odds involved.
Yeah, absolutely. That's I have to say I didn't think of it that way, but that is. You even, if I recall, you pick a character at the beginning, either a banker, a hunter. Um,
Yeah, and that was
uh,
based on the, difficulty level too. So it was just like if you were
yes.
banker, I think it was easiest, and I'm trying to remember if farmer was the hardest, but it was something like that, and so you were actually picking your difficulty level at the beginning, and you could name your characters whatever you wanted. So, Snakebite dies of dysentery, or, Dysentery dies of dysentery. If you were as immature as my class, that's how you
Of
played the
course.
game.
Of course. Why would you actually use names until you get older and then you want to start plugging in people you know? Um,
True.
so okay, so with IGN, you started on data. They moved over to content for a little bit, and I noticed like Fire Emblem. You've done a couple of pieces on Secret of Mana. Is there that one role playing games that no matter where you are, if you hear somebody talking about it, you have to stop and kind of run over there and jump into the conversation?
Yes, and it should surprise no one, but Final Fantasy.
Of course.
Of course, Final Fantasy IV is my favorite game of all time, and I am so excited about Final Fantasy 16. It's a little ridiculous.
So yours was four, because I know a lot of people are six and seven.
Yeah, 4 had all the juicy soap opera stuff going on where it was just like, I have a brother and, there's this love triangle and they like fly to the moon and it just gets more and more off rails and ridiculous. And it's just hilariously over the top. And it was the first game to introduce the active time battle system, which is, like it used to be like you take a turn, the enemy takes a turn, and then in this it's whoever, whoever speed is first. And then it was like really dynamic back in the day, and it was so cool. And so for, people literally half my age are like, that game is dumb and lame. And I'm like, but it was so groundbreaking. You don't understand.
Yeah. Yeah, they do miss out on that. They don't kind of see. I'm a survival horror guy on my own, on my side. And if you try to show somebody like the original Resident Evil, it's such a terrible game to try to play today. But it's also one of the most important horror games out there. So I guess that would be Final Fantasy IV, for you guys.
Resident Evil is the reason I cannot play horror games. It scared me so bad as a kid. So yeah, like by today's standards, it's like ridiculous. But back in the day, that was a legit scary game.
It was. It definitely was. And there's still some parts that can get you, even as old, as dated, as slow paced and kind of tank like it is. It still works. Um, so I don't. I could talk about horror, but I don't want to kind of steer towards me. But I am. So Final Fantasy is fascinating, kind of, for this conversation because it's not set in a real world at all. That's 100% fantasy. It's right there in the title, but if you look at the weapons they use, the currency and what it's based on, there is a lot of hints of real world history kind of worked in. Um, and I wonder, do you think that was any part of like your appreciation for those games? That a lot of it was kind of older, almost medieval type gameplay or setting.
That's an excellent question. And I have to say the answer is yes, because I like medieval history. And so, it's, kind of through the lens of something a little more romantic than what it really was. Like you read, you read about real medieval history, particularly during the Black Plague, and you're like, oh, this wasn't as fun as I thought. But there is something very romantic about that age when you're far removed. And I remember going to England and going to the White Tower and, going to all these historical places and seeing, armor from that period and the swords and everything, and, thinking how cool it looked. And so when you have something like Final Fantasy, the older Final Fantasy games, which are a weird mix of medieval and like steampunk, right? Like they all have airships in them.
Yeah.
But there was something very romantic. And I think that's why I like fantasy novels. Like I'm a huge fan of George R. R. Martin and Robert Jordan and authors like that, because it's so far removed from our own reality now that it's almost fantasy with swords and shields and chivalry. And I think you really nailed nailed it on the head, which is it's it's just sort of fantastical and weirdly romantic. And so I think that is why I like Final Fantasy games.
So would you like them as much if they were a little more, I don't want to say real, but a little more authentic to medieval history, where you have games like A Plague's Tale, where it's miserable because everybody's dying around them. Although there is a lot of death in Final Fantasy, it just seems to be
There is, but
handled well.
it's not like, for example, to take something which is, I wouldn't say more grounded in the sense that it still has a lot of magic in it, right? But if you take something like a BioWare game, which is a little closer to like Western D&D style, and it's a little more grounded in its, sort of grimness and realism and everything, I would still like and appreciate it, just because it is part of a historical era that I find so fascinating. I mean, even now, I'm looking up stuff on like the Tudor era, and I do think that I think a lot of people like Final Fantasy because of the fantasy part. But I do think you're right. There's something appealing if you already like that sort of look and feel of the Middle Ages in Europe. Then you're probably already kind of attracted to the series anyway.
Okay. Yeah, I think I would have to agree with that. I think it's a multifaceted series that a lot of people, like you said, they focus on the fantasy, but when you really break it down, there's so much to it. With the most of them, there's a kingdom. There's usually a tyrannical ruler at some point. Maybe not so much in like the later games, but definitely in the early, pre like Final Fantasy VII. Um, so so you love role playing, you love history, and that's going to get us to 2019 when you started the History and Games podcast. Before that, you did a little stint with Apple. So I'm wondering, what was the shift? You went from IGN, you were on the data side, did a little content, worked with Apple for a little bit, and then you said, you know what, it's time to go on my own, and I want to do a podcast focused specifically on history, video games. I know you did a little role playing series, Rapid RPG Reviews, and the what was it, the weekly RPG Roundup. But again, your focus right now is history and games. So what got you to that point that you wanted to do that on your own?
That's a good question. So the History and Games actually started as a Twitch stream back in, I think, 2015, when Twitch was really taking off and everyone was like, how can I make money off of Twitch? Well, I noticed that everyone was trying to make money off of Twitch the same way, which is scream at their computer monitor for
Yeah.
19 hours straight. And I was like, I don't think I have the stamina to do that, but I didn't know how to differentiate myself. And I was trying to think of something that would stand out and would benefit people. Like what is something that is positive? Because, games are kind of the low-hanging fruit that everyone, tries to pick when something goes wrong in the world. Everyone blames video games.
Yeah.
And I want to do something positive about video games and something that I loved about video games. And I was like, well, I love history and I love video games, and I can't help but notice that, like, for example, the Assassin's Creed series is based off of history. And my very first Twitch stream was for a game called Apotheon, and it's all based on ancient Greek history. And I was like, well, maybe I can do a Twitch stream twice a week about history. And that's actually how History and Games got started. And after a couple of years, like, it gained like a small following, but I realized that Twitch wasn't the best format for a history lecture because it's a very dynamic platform. And when people came into my Twitch stream, because they know I'm also a big anime fan and a big wrestling fan, so they'd come in and be like, oh my gosh, Megan, did you see what happened in the WWE or AEW tonight? Or did you catch the latest episode of My Hero Academia? And they wanted to talk about anything but history. And I realized I didn't exactly have the most captive audience because they were excited about whatever they wanted to talk about. And they're the ones who decide what I talk about, because that's what Twitch is. You let your
Yeah.
audience decide. So I decided to, well, all right, everyone's doing an audio podcast. Maybe this will work. And slowly I built an audience, and then I got a capture card finally. And I was like, maybe I could turn this into a video series. And so it's been a very slow evolution. There was no 0 to 90, success overnight thing. I'm still very slowly building an audience, but it started as a Twitch stream and then slowly became an audio podcast, and then slowly became a YouTube series. And it's still an audio podcast because I understand that some people, they prefer to learn by audio and some are visual. So I respect that. And I have both available to people if they want it.
Okay, that's a great idea. I mean, you kind of learn that with Twitch. It's just people are, that's the best way to put this. They want to learn how they want to learn. And on Twitch, it's not so much about them learning, it's they want to be the ones kind of guiding the conversation. So while it's a fantastic idea is to try and get people to learn on Twitch. It's just, I guess the audience is, as you had found out, not really too receptive to it. And I notice your YouTube channel does well. It definitely does well, especially for a channel that is pushing history, which it's not as popular as you would kind of think. As important as it is, especially when you kind of mingle it with video games, you would think people would latch onto it so quickly. And games like Assassin's Creed, Call of Duty, Battlefield, they're popular, but I don't think it's the history that makes them popular. I don't know if you kind of agree with that.
At first I did, but I'm finding that as I go along, if you kind of time it correctly and sort of get ahead of things. So my last video I did last week is about the Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. I didn't think anyone would watch that video because originally it was an audio podcast from a year ago. And I thought, I never did make a video series of this. I really should get around to that. And I tied it into the upcoming sequel, which looks really interesting. And I cannot wait to learn more about it. And people are interested. I think it's a matter of how do you get this out in front of people? Because you're right. History in itself, as important as it is not what people are looking for. So my most successful video is a tips and tricks video for Bravely Default 2, which did incredibly well, despite not even being a great video, but that's kind of the content people want. So it's not, going to be quite as popular as that straight off the bat. My hope is that by slowly building an audience and letting them know, hey, the whole reason the Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is so cool is because the developers, they base the art style on their own ancient history. Here's what they did. So my hope is that people realize that the game is even cooler because it's a loving homage to real life, and the developers went through a lot of trouble to get that right. And so I hope people not only appreciate the game more, but the actual development process more, because like Assassin's Creed Odyssey is super accurate in a lot of ways. And even though it's kind of ridiculous in others, the amount of research they do, I want to pay homage to that. And I think once people realize what it's about, I hope they appreciate it.
That's a fantastic point. They do put in a ton of research. And it was good to see. I think it was back with Origins was the first game, Assassin's Creed Origins, where they let players turn off all the gameplay and just let them explore the world, because a ton of that research just goes into making an accurate world, which it kind of does get lost in all of that chaotic gameplay. And I think they carried it over to Odyssey and maybe even Valhalla, or it's coming out in Valhalla, actually, I think very soon. So I kind of agree. I think they need to get that recognition for the amount of work they do. But also, so do people like you who take the time to kind of piece that apart. The Assassin's Creed Odyssey video or podcast that you did is 3 episodes long, which just kind of goes to show how much history is there. Now, you said that you love ancient Greek mythology. Was that kind of why you started with Assassin's Creed Odyssey on the podcast, or was that just kind of what was big at that time?
So I'm super obsessed with 5th century BCE, ancient Greece specifically. I've been working forever and ever and ever on a historical fiction book about the Persian Wars, which would cover, for those who are into pop culture, would cover things like, the 300 and Thermopylae and Leonidas and all that stuff. So um, I've been working on that over and over again, and I know that history really well. And then I learned that the next Assassin's Creed was going to be based on the opening of the Peloponnesian War. And Assassin's Creed already has a good reputation for trying to be accurate to certain things in history. And I got really excited, but I was a little nervous. I was like, I don't know, how are they going to screw this up? And I knew they did a good job because I remember making it to Athens. I had to go talk to Pericles in the game, which is kind of a cool thing to say. And I remember Cassandra was at the top of the Parthenon and she was doing a 360. She was looking around. And I had visited Greece back in 2009 and I had obsessively walked the Acropolis over and over and over again. So I kind of had an idea where everything was. And I was like, if I look in this direction, I could see, or I should see, the temple of Hephaestus. And sure enough, I saw the temple right where it was supposed to be. And then I was like, well, the Piraeus should be over here. And it was there. And I was like, man, they did their research and they like had all the little walking tour details. And I was like, man, somebody went above and beyond. And it was so impressive. And so I started with Assassin's Creed Odyssey because it's such a cool concept of having a royal Spartan mercenary fighting in the Peloponnesian War. And it was my opportunity to be like, well, how realistic is that? Because that sounds like bunk. And the answer was very surprising. It was way more realistic than it had any right to be.
So now when you play games like Assassin's Creed, do you find it difficult to look past any sort of like glaring historical error, or are you able to kind of say, okay, this is still like a fantasy setting, so I really have to let it go?
Oh, I'm easily humored. I don't expect it to be one-to-one unless the game advertises it that way. And I've never really seen like sort of like God of War has some like cool stuff, or even like Hades, one of my favorite games from last year, right? Like that game is amazingly detailed in Greek mythology, like really impressively so. But it doesn't have to be one-to-one because ultimately I want the developer to tell the story they want to tell. And so it's kind of when people get mad at 300 and I'm like, you do know it's not based on Herodotus. It's based on a 25 page comic book like Frank Miller. I mean, come on, have fun with this. Like, as long as you keep it in perspective, it's like, Gladiator is not actually a very historically accurate movie, but it entertained people. And that's the important thing. So if you put in the perspective of, as long as it gets people interested in the history, like maybe they watch 300, they play Assassin's Creed Odyssey and they're like, man, I want to learn more about it. I'm going to go buy a copy of Thucydides. That's awesome. That's what the history in games is about. It's about, showing how games can be a positive educational tool, because even if they're not historically accurate, it gets kids and adults interested in history. And that's what we want. We want people to be like, hey, I didn't know a lot about this. Now I want to go learn about it.
Absolutely, and I think you kind of bring up a point where we have to, with people that watch 300 and think that this should be like a one-to-one retelling of the Battle of Thermopylae. Um, we have to separate authenticity and accuracy, because they are, at their core, they kind of are two different things. You want a game that wants to be historically accurate. You want it to kind of deviate a little bit, or else it's going to be boring. If you watched a real version of the Battle of Thermopylae, it's probably not going to be as exciting as Frank Miller's vision. And that's kind of the same thing with games like Assassin's Creed. Battlefield kind of got a lot of flack a couple of years ago for not being completely accurate to history, and that's because it can't be. And I think the point, like you had just brought up, it's not to be fully educational, but it's to get you piqued. It's to pique your interest and to say, hey, this is a thing that actually happened. Maybe not this way, but why don't you go find out how it actually happened? So I think that's a fantastic point.
Yeah, I'm actually right now I'm playing a game that is based on, I hope I don't butcher this name because my French is terrible, but it's actually based on the World War I Battle of Verdun, which was one of the longest battles of World War One and was a French victory, but it was a brutal battle, and I knew nothing about it. World War One is a difficult subject for me because it's so grim,
Yeah.
but I actually got a code to play the game. It's an excellent first-person game where you're on the French side and you're fighting, and it made me want to go look up the history more, in more detail about this battle, but also World War One in general. And that's the power of video games, is that when you get a game, and this one is, it does try to be pretty historically accurate. It's an educational tool that way. But the idea that, hey, this is your gateway into history. I mean, let's do it. Let's really sort of hold up these video games that help us learn about history and get us interested in education. I don't think video games get enough praise for that.
I agree, 100% they don't. And I kind of building off of that. So I'm going to assume that's an indie developed game. That's an indie developer for the World War One that you're playing right
I'm
now.
actually looking up the developer right now because I do want to give them a shout out, because it was, it's it's an important thing to know about. So here we go. It is okay. So it is M2H and Blackmail Games. So World War One, Verdun, Western Front, and merciless trench warfare immerses you and your squad in intense battles of attack and defense. And it's a well done game. It's an online multiplayer game, and I suck at those usually. So I'm probably the person that everyone's like, "Oh no, you're on our team, great." But it tries hard to be, historical, and I appreciate that, and it makes me want to go learn more about World War One. And how many games can say that, or like how many anything can say that. There's not many books and movies and video games based on World War One, because it's a tough war to cover, but it's important to know about.
Yeah, it doesn't have that kind of showmanship that World War Two weirdly has. So it isn't as much fun to cover. And I noticed the games that do cover it do kind of glorify a bit of it to kind of make it feel like World War Two. It's really hard to explain why they were so different, even though they both were, devastating on both sides. But I have to ask, since that was an indie developed game, Assassin's Creed is a AAA developer. Do you think that indie developers maybe have more of a they kind of have to keep it more authentic because they have more to prove, or that maybe they want to keep it more authentic so that they kind of show that, hey, we may be an indie studio, but look at all the research we did for this, and play our game type of thing?
I think that's an interesting question. And I think that maybe, and this is just a guess on my part, but I feel like indie developers, they want to be historically accurate, but it might be like, hey, that's not as, flashy as bigger, more fictionalized game, right? Like to make these games realistic, is, it's not quite as over the top with this, flying and lasers and pew 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 and everything like that. And so maybe they have to go indie because they're not as flashy, because they refuse to, to be as soap operatic. And so they have to go the indie route so that they can be accurate. But it's a good question, because even Assassin's Creed, with all the research they do, there's all that futuristic stuff that's thrown in there, which makes it kind of fictional. And so it's an interesting question of like, history is always stranger, like fact is always stranger than fiction, but at the same time, it's a lot grimmer and more grounded. And really, why do we play games? For a lot of us, it's escapism. We want to escape. We don't want to be reminded of, the grimness of history and where we are and where we're going. We want to escape into fantasy. And something about like the Battle of Tannenberg or Verdun, that doesn't allow us to escape quite as much. So it may be that these developers, they'd love to go commercial, but because it's not as commercially appealing, maybe they'd have to go indie.
Probably really hard to market a game where everybody just dies at the end, because that's just
Yeah.
happening. That's history. Yeah. History is one long Game of Thrones episodes where everybody's going to die at the end. So that's a very good point, and I think I have to agree with that. That it probably is about the commercialism aspect of gaming. Um, so okay, so you're playing the World War One. Are you playing any other kind of historically based games right now that may be showing up in a podcast soon?
Well, I'm still so it's gonna have several parts, but I'm still going through the Legend of Zelda, which is all about the Jomon period of Japan, which was 14,000 years ago. So it's really fascinating. So shout out to the developers on Nintendo for doing their due diligence with that game. It's really cool. I'm trying to, I don't want to spoil it, I'm trying to get a historian on. So I sometimes interview historians or people of interest for history and games. I had Dr. Jackson Crawford on, who is an expert in Norse mythology and language. And we talked about a little bit about Assassin's Creed Valhalla and some of the mythology that might make it into the game. And I'm trying to interview someone else about Horizon Forbidden West, which the Horizon series is absolutely fantastic. Good job, Guerrilla Games. And it's all about what is cool about that series? It's all about basically robotic dinosaurs gone rogue, right? Like that's an oversimplification. The lore is much deeper than that, but who does not love dinosaurs and robots? And then you get like robotic dinosaurs. How cool is that? Well, there is a historian who actually covers man's history and fascination with both dinosaurs and robots. And I'm trying to get that person on my show.
I kind of hope you do, because that also, when I look at historical games, I would say a primitive era is always the one that's most overlooked, and that was what I really loved about Horizon. It still had that futuristic edge because you're blowing things up and there's robots chasing after you, but it still felt very primitive. The way they dressed, even the tools they used, as though they were electronic in nature, they were still very much so based on anything that would be used to like take down a mammoth or something along those lines.
Exactly.
So I really hope you kind of get that interview. That would be really cool to hear. So when you set out to, or I guess what sparks your interest in a game that you say, okay, I really want to do a podcast on this. So Legend of Zelda, maybe that connection to Asian history that you had back in college. Assassin's Creed, you really love Greek mythology, so Odyssey was, the perfect choice. But there's a host of different historical games out there that you can cover. So how do you kind of pinpoint which ones you want to do next?
So that's a good question. Originally, before I built an audience and I just wanted to see if this was sustainable or if it could work, it was just like whatever tickled my fancy. So like when I started back in 2019, I was still playing like all the DLC and stuff for Assassin's Creed Odyssey. I was obsessed with that game. Same with Fire Emblem Three Houses, which I knew it had history, but I was surprised at all the secret history in it. Like I knew it was based on either, I was trying to figure it out. Is it based on, the Holy Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire, da da da? And then the whole backstory is all a mix of ancient cultures and history. And so sometimes it's just like what I stumble on in a game. But now, as I'm slowly building an audience, I have to be a little more organized. So I look at the like 2021 calendar and I'm like, what is coming up that could be of historical interest? Okay, Far Cry seems to be based on some sort of island banana republic. Should I cover the early history of banana republics? Should I cover, so again, Horizon, Forbidden West is coming up. There's a historian I'd love to talk to about, early fossil hunters and man's early obsession with automatons. There's what else is there? There's a God of War Ragnarok coming up. So do I talk to Dr. Jackson Crawford again about Norse mythology, or do I, talk to an expert about like, here's realistically what was happening during that time period when legends of Ragnarok started to come about. So I'm getting better at organizing and planning, but honestly, I mean, to be totally honest, sometimes it is just whatever I wake up and I'm like, it would be a cool episode if I did something on Yakuza, right? Like Yakuza is a really fun, popular series. Or can I somehow find the history of Mario? Does Mario have any history? So I'm a little scatterbrained and it kind of depends on what I feel like, but I promise I'm trying to be better organized.
I mean, it's tough. You take on the role of content manager, and you know that you have to stick to what people are interested in. Like you said, God of War, the New Horizon, but you do have to make sure the content is something you care about, or else it's just going to come out flat.
Right.
And I have to say, circling back to Fire Emblem, I didn't know. I played like the early Fire Emblem games. I didn't play Three Houses, but I didn't realize how much history is kind of snuck in there. And I wanted to say that first two episodes I think I had a chance to listen to has inspired kind of a blog series that I'm going to do with our writer on how games like that can kind of sneak history in, and how your video game doesn't have to be like this. Oh, this is taking place in ancient Rome, or the I don't know, somewhere in Japan, ancient Japan. Um, it can be snuck in there. It can be a fictional world with all of this inspirational history that it's inspired by real history. So I just want to make sure I had a chance to say that.
Oh, that makes me feel so good. And I just, again, shout out to the developers of Fire Emblem, because initially I knew that Fire Emblem was always sort of tied to Celtic history, and I continued that a little bit in Three Houses. But when I was trying to trying to make sense of the confusing backstory, and it's all about like everything from ancient Egypt to ancient Greece to like ancient, Nabatea and the, Jordan desert. And I'm like, what is going on? This is so much more interesting. And it's, in order to make sense of the backstory, you kind of have to know these little historical Easter eggs. And so that's what I'm hoping to inspire people with, like, go out and learn this history, because you will appreciate this game so much better if you're like, oh my God, that was an obscure shout out to like this. There's a whole thing about King Lear that makes it into Fire Emblem. Like the whole house of like the Golden Deer is based on King Lear characters who are based on quasi legendary figures, Welsh figures and like Celtic figures and all this stuff. And I'm like, this is mind blowing. How come no one talks about this?
I guess because it is kind of snuck underneath all the original story that they come up with, and you don't really make the connection right away. But thankfully, people like you, and I'm sure other historians out there, kind of can pick it out and let people know that this is here. You want to kind of pay attention to it, maybe learn a bit more out of it. So yeah, that was I kind of appreciated that. I like that we can look at games that aren't at all based in reality and still find a hint of reality in it and say, hey, this is from ancient Egypt. That's kind of fascinating. Um, and again, it's I can't imagine the thought process a developer has to go through to say, we're building this world. It's there's no semblance of a real civilization in it, but I do want to make sure that I pay homage to something that happened in our past. So it's got to be a fascinating kind of leap to go from fantasy to reality like that, and then just kind of go right back to fantasy without really making the reality that you stuck in known. Excuse me. Um, so okay, so you've got history in games. You do have a Patreon for it, and I noticed on the Patreon, I think it was, that you want to turn this into a TV show. So is that something you're still pursuing, or do you kind of like where it is now and you want to keep it status quo?
So the realistic goal is, even if I could just make it sustainable, right? Like I could do this for a living. I may not be rich, but I could do it for a living. That's like the realistic goal. But yes, my triumphant moment in my head is, I think this would be a fun thing to do as like a Netflix series or an Amazon series with the right type of production. Unfortunately, I began the video portion of history and games during a pandemic, which means I can't travel. I can't travel to museums. I can't travel to interview people. I cannot travel to historical places. This was like the worst timing ever. I have it still in my end of 2019 journal. Here are my 2020 goals, and I had big goals, and COVID was like, ha ha, no.
Yeah.
So we're gonna try again, and what I'd like to do is make like a sizzle reel or a demo reel, and show it to people and be like, video games do have the power to educate people, and here's how. And then have a super clip of interviews. Like you have one episode of, like, say, God of War, and let's say the question is Kratos a, and we'll go to old school Kratos, not necessarily the Kratos now, but was Kratos a good realistic Spartan? I did a blog about this years ago, back in like 2009 on IGN, the IGN blogs, and I did a comparison, right, of like what he gets right and what he gets wrong, what Sunny Cinematic gets right, and what they clearly took sort of leverage on, or they, you know, they did their own thing. And it'd be so cool to talk to real experts, like real historians. I like, can I interview Bethany Hughes about this, you know, who is a historian who knows all about Spartans? Can I talk to Paul Cartledge about this? Can I go to Sony Santa Monica and interview people about the process? You know, can I go to the creators and talk about it? And that could be a full episode, like 60-minute episode, where you'd have gameplay capture and interviews. And could we travel to Sparta? Like, there's this weird victory thing in my head that I think would be really interesting, but who's going to pay for it? I can't pay for it. So it sure would be great if Netflix was like, look, this could make us money. We'll pick up a tab. Here's how it is. But like, the Patreon is there to keep the dream alive. And I cannot thank my Patreon supporters enough. You guys are awesome for believing in me. And I promise more content is coming when you know, we sort of get to quasi-normal, where everyone gets their vaccines and everyone can travel safely again. I would love to do all of that stuff, just to put that power of positivity out there with history and video games.
I think it's doable, and I think even specifically Amazon and Netflix would likely jump at the chance for something like that, because it's, you know, Travel Channel has the monopoly on kind of shows like that, where they go into history of different things, but they don't focus on video games or movies or anything specific, something pop culture. But I think something like that would live perfectly on Netflix and Amazon. And I want to make sure that we do our part as much as we can. So you have the Patreon. You have, I think it was 3 different tiers. $1 a month gets you access to all the base level content. $3 a month gets access to a monthly newsletter, and then it was $5 a month gives the supporter voting power on the next game that you cover. And I want to make sure, was there anything else that I may have missed in terms of?
Yeah, so like $5 gets you the weekly wrap up, where I talk about my week and, you know, what's coming up. At $10 and $25, you get not only early access, but you get some exclusive stuff. So I just started a exclusive book review thing where I review historical books and I let people know about it. And then at the $25 mark, you also get, at the beginning of my videos, you'll see it kind of go by. You'll see like, thanks to my Patreons. And if you're scholar level, you'll get a thank you at the beginning, because, you know, I appreciate that kind of support. But, you know, even $1, even $3, even $5, which, you know, that adds up for a lot of people, and I understand. So anything that people can give, you know, is really appreciated, because it allows me to do this full time. It is a full-time gig. I don't like it when people sort of, pardon my language, but half-ass history, where they do just the sort of surface level stuff. My whole thing is it's accessible, but it also is a big deep dive into the history. Like, I try to get little cool nitty gritty details that hopefully you've never heard of, that make it into games. So I'm like, we got to give a shout out to whatever, you know, whatever researcher was part of the team for Assassin's Creed or on Ubisoft's team, because they zeroed in on like an obscure ancient song, a hymn to Apollo, that actually does make it into Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Like, those kind of little nitty gritty details, that's the best stuff, but you got to dig down to get the best treasure, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That is not something that's easily researched, and we know that from our experience over here too. So I again, you know, if you guys out there want to help support Meghan get this going, I think it would be kind of a fascinating TV show, and important. I think I mentioned this a lot with people I interview. I think schools need to start learning the resources that they can use, and I think video games are surprisingly a notable resource when it comes to history. Assassin's Creed is used kind of frequently, but there are, you know, indie developed games I think really need to be kind of pushed to the forefront too. So I would love to see a TV show like this pushed out there, because I think it would get the conversation going and get people to realize, and you talked about this very early on in the interview, video games aren't evil. They're trying to do it now. They're trying to push Grand Theft Auto and get that banned, but video games aren't evil. They can serve a very important purpose in society. And so I'd like to push everyone to Meghan's Patreon. And Meghan, was there anything else you wanted to plug while you're here? We've got your History and Games podcast. You do have the YouTube channel. And that is just under your name, I believe. The YouTube channel is just Meghan Sullivan
Yeah,
or
it's
Meg
it's it's
Sullivan.
just it's just Meg Sullivan. It's even shorter. It's just Meg Sullivan,
Easier to remember.
Megsullivan. You don't even have to put in Megan because my name is spelled kind of weird. It's Meghan, and I think the H throws people. So I'm like, you know what? Meg Sullivan is perfectly fine. You can also join me on Twitch at Celtic_Queen. Think, Megan, think. This is your opportunity to advertise yourself. Why are you so terrible at this? You can follow me on Instagram at Celtic_Queen_Meg. And okay, let's see. Twitter is MEGHAN_IGN. It still has the IGN in it because I don't want to lose my little blue check mark. But like IGN, it's an empty acronym now. So, fill that in with whatever you want. But I think that's enough advertising for me. I don't want to completely bore the audience, but I would love their support. And thank you so much for having me on this show, by the way. This is very cool what you do.
Of course. I really appreciate you taking the time to kind of sit with us this late at night. And I do hope we catch up again later as you get more stuff out there on history and games. And real quick, for everybody that wants to know, History and Games is available on pretty much every podcast outlet that I can think of. Apple Podcast, Spotify, Google Podcast, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, and just kind of go through the gamut. You'll be able to find it. So again, Meghan, thank you so much. I really do appreciate that you were here chatting with us. And I hope kind of this gets off the ground for you. I'd love to see it kind of pop up on something that I subscribe to.
Me too. That would be great. But thank you so much, Mark. I really appreciate you having me on.
Of course. And we will chat again soon, I'm sure. Thank you, Meghan.